On February 26 of 1999, the badly decomposed remains of a little boy we found near the corner of Clifton Springs and Clifton Springs Church Road in a wooded area near a church cemetery on the eastern side of Atlanta called DeKalb County, and he would be found by a cemetery worker preparing for a funeral. No one knew who this little boy was, who left him there, or where he came from, but they did determine he was around 5 to 7 years old, of African American descent, and had been deceased for around 3 to 6 months. However, he appeared to be laid out with care and had been found wearing a blue and white plaid shirt, red denim jeans, and brown Timberland boots. And he was thought at this time to either be from Georgia or northern Florida. Tests would end up being run to try to determine his cause of death. However, that did not lead anywhere. What they did find, however, through toxicology was that there was cold medicine in his system.
We now know about as much as we are going to know from forensic evidence about the body found in a South DeKalb cemetery last Friday. It's an African American boy, about 4 feet tall, 5 to 7 years old, wearing a hooded jacket, denim pants, and Timberland hiking boots. What we don't know is who he is.
Recruits lined up to look for new clues in the death of a child whose body was found in these woods Friday. At this point, investigators believe the child was African American between the ages of 5 and 7. But because the body was so badly decomposed after lying here for 3 to 6 months, police don't know if this was a boy or girl or how the child died.
The condition of the body precludes a facial identification, fingerprints, and things that we normally use to identify someone.
Now, much like the boy in the box from Pennsylvania, this little boy's identity and story would not be determined until decades later. And he would end up being nicknamed as Dennis or Clifton Doe by authorities who are working on his case to give him an identity in the meantime. We see this happen a lot with people, especially children that are found deceased. I think it gives the person humanity and it makes the investigators connect with the person a lot more. When you don't know anything about them, their entire identity is unknown. If you give them a name, you get a connection with them, you know? In October of that year, the coroner's office would end up receiving a phone call from a woman in an emotional state who claimed the little boy's name was Don Anderson. This call would end up being traced to the Florida Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Florida. However, this would end up being a dead end. In an attempt to get more information, the authorities would end up having a mannequin constructed of what they thought this little boy looked like when he was alive, and they would end up dressing it up in the clothing that this little boy was wearing. It is really good that the police ended up trying to do whatever they could to try to get leads, and we have to remember that this was the late 90s. They didn't have the technology that we have today. At one point, a teacher in Georgia would end up leaving a tip thinking that it may be a little boy who had disappeared from school. However, this little boy would eventually be found, thankfully. And there seemed over the years to be quite a few tips like this that would come in, yet all of them led to nowhere.
That's why parents and grandparents following this case find it so puzzling.
It disturbed me that it was so young and had no one even claimed the child.
That no one has come forward, not even knowing this child, or it's just funny. It's just really strange.
In the year 2000, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also known as NCMEC, would get involved and end up creating sketches over the years of how they depicted that little Dennis would look like. So that is how we would eventually get some more modern sketches of Dennis. However, despite this, decades would pass with little to no information on what may have happened to this little boy. Until 2019 would roll around when NCMEC would release a new facial reconstruction rendering of Dennis that would end up receiving some new media coverage. And the very next year, in May of 2019, a tip would come in of a woman claiming that she knew who this little boy was and she knew his mother. So the authorities jumped on this lead and began to look into it. When authorities eventually found the woman that was being accused of being this dead little boy's mother, they would end up doing a DNA test, and it was conclusive. This was little Dennis's mother. Her name is Teresa Ann Bailey Black. And this little boy would finally be identified after 20 years as 6-year-old William Hamilton. But what happened here? Who is Teresa? Why did she never report over the years her young son missing? Well, back in 1992, a then 14 to 15-year-old Teresa would end up giving birth to William. A couple years later, in May of 1994, Teresa would end up living in a boarding house in southwest Charlotte, North Carolina, with a 40-year-old man named Jimmy Lee Samuels and his girlfriend, a 23-year-old named Tamika Wooten. It's unknown at this time if 2-year-old William was living at this boarding house with his mother. However, what we do know is that at one point, Jimmy and Tamika would end up getting in a fight, where Jimmy would begin hitting his girlfriend with a golf club. And when Teresa and Tamika would try to flee the house, they would be chased down by Jimmy. Now, some way, somehow, Teresa ended up obtaining a gun, and she would end up firing a warning shot into the air, and then a bullet ended up being fired into Jimmy's back. Now, Jimmy would end up being taken to the hospital where he would succumb to his injuries. And a then 16-year-old Teresa would be charged with voluntary manslaughter in September of that year, and she would be released a year later when she was around 18 years old. Again, at this point in time, it's unclear where William was, if he was there, if he was with a babysitter, which we will be talking about in a moment, but a lot of little William's life is very unknown. But by 1998, Teresa and William were still living in Charlotte, North Carolina. However, in December of that year, Teresa would abruptly remove William from school and take him down to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, this is where I want to talk about a woman named Ava, who was William's babysitter, and she seemed to essentially raise him for most of his life, it seemed. Ava would end up telling reporters that she spent a lot of time with William and his mother, who only lived a couple streets away from her in Charlotte, saying that she babysat William daily for 4 years straight. Before school, after school, she was always with him. And she said that William was a happy and smart little boy who was wise beyond his years. William was said to love to read encyclopedias, and he was really proud to know big words. Ava saying, and I quote, "He was a gregarious little fellow. He was like an old man in a little boy's body," end quote.
But we had good times. I loved him. I did a lot for him. I cooked for him. I took him his first bath. Taught him how to tie his shoes.
However, despite being friends with Teresa, she said that Teresa was extremely impatient with William and said that she wasn't loving or affectionate towards him. And she said that when Teresa came and told her that they were leaving North Carolina to go to Georgia, it was heartbreaking for them. It seemed from all of this that Ava was more of a mother to William than Teresa was. And she was the one that took care of him most of the time. She was the one that showed him love and affection and provided him with everything that a little boy would need. As you seen in the interview, she said, she was there when he took his first bath. She was there with him when he learned to tie his shoes. She was there for all of those steps that a mother should have been, and it seemed that Teresa was not. However, Teresa was legally his mother, and it was Teresa's choice if she wanted to take him to Georgia. When they said their goodbyes, Ava said, and I quote, "We said each other's names. William hugged me and I hugged him. We kept hugging. She had to practically pry us apart to get him back in the car. That was it. That was the last time that I saw him." End quote. Now, why Teresa took William to Georgia and what happened next is mostly unknown. What little we do know is that Teresa may have been working as an exotic dancer in Georgia and was possibly staying at women and children's shelters while there. According to relatives and friends, Teresa would end up returning to Charlotte in late 1999 without William, and she began to tell different stories about his whereabouts. Ava said she approached Teresa and asked her different questions on where William was. However, Teresa would dodge all the questions. She was essentially walking around like William never existed. Ava saying, and I quote, "I was constantly approaching her, asking her questions, asking her, like it was like, how can you walk around here living life like William never existed?" End quote. Which really makes me wonder why no one ever called the police at this point in time, why Teresa's family never called the police, why an investigation didn't seem to be done at that point in time. Like, what was she saying to people to ease their minds that William was completely fine in another state alone by himself? However, Ava never stopped looking for little William, and she claims that she began to search for William on her own at this point. She said that she looked up phone numbers at the local library for places like Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, of all different hospitals, homeless shelters, police stations, social service agencies, bus stations. She said she called everyone she could figure out too. And we have to remember back in 1999, we didn't have social media like we had today. So she had to literally go to a phone book and call each place individually. And she said she did this every single day, sometimes for hours. She would fall asleep with papers scattered around her and the phone by her side. She would jump every time the phone rang and answer it, thinking it would be a call about William. But that call never came. And eventually, Ava lost track of Teresa because Teresa seemed to kind of be very transient. As we will learn, she jumped around a lot from state to state. She never was kind of in the same place for long. Again, we don't really know too much about her, but from what we do know, she seemed to be quite troubled. However, it seems that when William's body was discovered is around the time when Teresa ended up going back to North Carolina. And between 1999 to 2003, Teresa would end up being arrested for multiple different nonviolent crimes. She wouldn't resurface again until 2010 in Alaska, completely out of the way of where she used to be. And this is when she was being sued for unpaid medical bills. After that, it seems that she moved to Arizona around 2017. During all of these years that passed while Teresa was running around the country, Ava was still searching for Teresa's son. She ended up having a family of her own and still talked about little William. She said her children knew William like he was a little brother to them. And she hoped that one day she would be able to figure out what happened to him until May of 2020 rolled around. And she came across that photo of Dennis that was created by NCMEC, saying, and I quote, "I screamed. My daughter came round running and tears running down my face. I was sure. I felt that's him. It was him." end quote. And that's where we got that tip that led to us unraveling this entire case of who William was. But what we still don't really know is what happened to little William. Teresa would end up being indicted and arrested in Phoenix, Arizona in June of 2022, and she was extradited back to Georgia. At this point in time, Teresa is being charged with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of cruelty to a child, 1 count of aggravated assault, and 1 count of concealing the death of another. Now, I'm not sure why she's getting 2 counts for the murder. Let me know if you have any answers to that. But now we don't exactly know what was going on in Georgia and how William ended up dead, but we do know a couple new details. Now, it is stated in the indictment that Teresa administered a substance or substances containing diphenhydramine and acetaminophen, which are different drugs that are in cold medicines, essentially saying that she drugged him with cold medicine, and then it goes on to say that she hit William in the head and his body was then put in the woods. Again, there wasn't much to determine from his remains. There was no cause of death, so I'm not sure how they got this information, if she confessed something, if she admitted something, if someone else said something, but they are now pretty determined that he was drugged with the cold medicine and then hit in the head. District Attorney Sherry Boston saying, and I quote, "For far too long, this precious little boy had no name and no story. Through the tireless efforts of several individuals and organizations who were determined not to let this little boy be forgotten, William has now been identified and justice will be served in his memory." End quote. Now, Teresa is currently being held with no bond, and jury selection and trial will be held on January 2nd of 2024, so just a week or so from now. But I do want to say, it does seem like Teresa had a rough upbringing, just from the little bit of information that we do have. We don't know much about her childhood, but clearly she was a very young teen mom. We know nothing about William's father. She seemed to have no support. She was living in a violent boarding house at only 15, 16 years old. She was involved in this DV situation between 2 other people where she ended up killing a man. All of this before she's 18. She seemed to be in and out of the system far too often from the time she was a teenager. She traveled all over the country. Again, as far as we know, she was doing exotic dancing in Georgia, so it seems like she was involved with some very seedy crowds. Again, we talk a lot on my channel about people who are addicted to drugs or working in, the sex industry and things like that, and how their cases are important. Well, this is the opposite end of this, where a child has died from someone who was involved in this stuff. And I do have sympathy for Teresa if this is her life. Again, we don't know much about her family or her upbringing, but it seems like this has been her entire life. This is all she's really known, and I feel sympathy for that. I really do. She seemed to have been affected by poverty, by the system, by bad choices, and being friends with the wrong people possibly. Again, it makes me really question, why did she go to Georgia? And the fact that she may have been exotic dancing there and living in women and children's shelters makes me wonder, is there a world where she didn't do this to William? She didn't actually kill him, but she was involved with it. I think there may be a possibility. Say, for instance, she went to Georgia because she had a boyfriend. A lot of times these boyfriends are actually pimps, and they can manipulate girls and women into doing things that, it's a story as old as time at this point with situations like this. Could she have possibly gone to Georgia for reasons such as this? Could it be possible that she had a boyfriend that eventually turned into her pimp, and maybe he did something to William and she ended up covering it up? I think if she was involved with stuff like this, that there is a possibility, yes. And that is why William was found laid to rest in the woods near a cemetery. It looked like he was cared for. He was laid there in a loving way, it was said. However, Teresa never reported her son missing. She never called the police. There could be so many reasons to that. If this was the case and she was in a bad situation, maybe she was terrified of whoever did this. But then there's the fact that she's had decades to say something and she hasn't. Then we have the fact that if she has been in the system since she was a teenager, maybe she doesn't trust the system. We see that happen quite often where people don't trust the system, so they don't report things. Could that be the case? I think that's a possibility as well. However, she did return to North Carolina after this happened when his body was discovered, and she made up stories and she continued to lie and she continued to cover this up. So that really makes me question if she was the one that ended up doing this. On top of that, we have Ava's allegations against Teresa saying that she was never loving towards William, that she never was caring towards her son, which again, that could be because she experienced a lot of trauma when she was younger. Maybe she just didn't have those feelings in her towards her child. Maybe she had resentment against men. We've seen that happen in cases before. And since she had a son at such a young age, maybe she just, when she moved to Georgia, decided she didn't want that liability anymore. She didn't want to have this, other person she had to care for. She wanted to do her own thing, and she ended up doing away with little William so that she could have her freedom and her independence. What really bothers me about that avenue is, why didn't she just leave him with Ava then? Because Ava seemed to be taking care of him 90% of the time anyways, and it seemed that they were devastated to leave each other. I really don't think, after everything that we've learned, that Ava would have really cared if Teresa had been like, I'm going to Georgia, can you take care of him? You can have custody of him, you take care of him, I'm out. I feel like Ava would have been like, okay, cool. Like, he's basically my son anyways at this point. But that didn't happen. For some reason, Teresa took him and went to Georgia. And that's what really confuses me. If she didn't want him, if she didn't want to have to take care of him, if that was the reason, why didn't she just leave him with Ava? But at this point, we really don't know, because Teresa's pleading not guilty to all of this. We don't know how this is all going to unravel. I'm really interested in this case, if new information will come out in trial. I'm sure there is a lot more information that we do not know that the police do know. But what I want to know is how you all feel about this. Again, I'm trying to see this from either side. Could it be possible that Teresa didn't directly kill her son, and possibly maybe it was a boyfriend or something that lost their temper and, did something to him, and she's the one that disposed of the body then and then just covered it up for one reason or another. But again, she seems to be quite troubled. She doesn't look to be doing very well from this mugshot that I have up on the screen right now. This is the last mugshot that I found. But what I do know is that either way, little William deserves justice. It's been 20 years too long. He would be in his early 30s at this point if he was allowed to live. It's tragic. And I'm very glad that after all this time, we finally have a name. We finally have a story for this little boy who seemed to be extremely bright and brilliant and had an extremely bright future ahead of him. And it's tragic and it's sad, but at least we finally know his name and he can finally be laid to rest, and hopefully William can get some justice now. Again, I want to know how you all feel. Are you on the side that there may be a possibility that she is innocent? And I say innocent very lightly because I think she's definitely involved in some way or another. Or do we 100% feel like, no, she did this, there's no way someone else did this? I don't know, but I do want to know how you all feel. Let's chat about it down below. And as always, if there are any cases you want me to look into, let me know down below. There are a few cases that people have commented that I'm still working on, so those will be coming out in the near future. But if there are any other that you're interested in me looking at and covering and talking about, leave it down below. And I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I will see you in the next video.